Imagine this. It's 1944. The air in France is thick with the tension of war. You're a soldier hiding, looking out across a field. And you see something strange. A group of American GIs, but they're not carrying guns. They're carrying an inflatable tank. 4 men lift a 40-ton Sherman tank with their bare hands. It sounds impossible. It sounds like a scene from a dream. But this was very real. This was the work of one of World War II's best-kept secrets, the Ghost Army. This wasn't an army that fought with bullets and bombs. Their weapons were rubber, sound speakers, and imagination. They were a traveling roadshow of deception, a phantom force of about 1,100 men. Many of them were artists, designers, advertising men, and sound engineers, recruited from the art schools and ad agencies of New York and Philadelphia. They were tasked with a unique mission: to fool the German army, to make the enemy see things that weren't there and hear things that didn't exist. Their job was to draw fire so that other soldiers wouldn't have to. By 1944, the war in Europe was at a critical point. The Allies had landed in Normandy, but every inch of ground was hard-won. The German army was experienced, entrenched, and deadly. Allied commanders were facing a brutal reality. They were losing thousands of men in every major push. They needed an edge, something the enemy wouldn't see coming. The idea was simple but radical. What if you could make the enemy believe your army was in one place when it was actually somewhere else entirely? What if you could create a phantom division big enough to make the Germans move their own troops to fight a ghost? It was a gamble, a huge one, but the potential to save lives was immeasurable. And so, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was born. It was a unit unlike any other. They actively sought out creative thinkers, men whose job in civilian life was to capture attention and shape perception. Artists like Bill Blass, the future fashion designer, painters, architects, men who understood perspective, shadow, and illusion. They were given a strange and secret briefing. They were told they would be using visual, sonic, and radio deception to confuse the enemy about the size and location of Allied forces. Think about that for a moment. These young men, who might have been designing department store windows or painting murals just a year earlier, were now being asked to create the largest, most elaborate illusions on the deadliest stage in the world. Their canvas was the battlefield. Their paint was rubber and canvas. Their soundtrack was the roar of an army that existed only on wire recordings. They had to be convincing because if they failed, the consequences were very, very real. Their bag of tricks had 3 main parts. First, there was the visual deception. This was the world of inflatable rubber. They had hundreds of life-sized, inflatable tanks, cannons, jeeps, trucks, and even airplanes. From the air, or from a distance, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. The soldiers would inflate them under the cover of darkness, creating the illusion of a massive armored division preparing for an attack. They even made fake tracks with special rollers to complete the picture. It was a piece of theater performed for an audience of enemy spy planes and reconnaissance patrols. Next came the sound. The sonic deception. The unit had a series of powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks. They could blast recordings of military sounds at 150 decibels, so loud they could be heard up to 15 miles away. These weren't just random noises. They were carefully crafted audio stories. One recording might be the sound of a tank column arriving at night. Another might be the sounds of bridge construction. The sound engineers would mix these tracks live, creating a completely believable soundscape of an army on the move. They were DJs of deception, playing a soundtrack for a war that wasn't really there. The third piece of the puzzle was radio deception. The Germans were experts at intercepting radio traffic. So, the Ghost Army gave them something to listen to. A small team of operators would mimic the radio signals of a large unit. They learned the specific communication styles of different divisions, the little quirks, the unique sign-offs. They'd send out fake messages, creating a web of chatter that suggested a huge force was operating in their area. They were selling a story, and the Germans were buying it. They performed this elaborate show more than 20 times across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. They would arrive at a position, set up their illusions, and play their part for a few days. Their goal was often to hold a thin line, to make a small force look massive, allowing the real divisions to move secretly to another location for the real attack. They were always close to the front lines, often deliberately drawing enemy artillery fire to make their deception more convincing. It was incredibly dangerous work. They were a small unit with very little real firepower. If the German army ever decided to attack them directly, they would have been annihilated. Their masterpiece, their final and greatest performance, came in March of 1945. It was called Operation Viersen. The Allies were preparing for the final, massive push into Germany across the Rhine River. Two entire divisions of the U.S. 9th Army, about 30,000 men, were set to cross at a specific point. The Ghost Army was sent 10 miles south with a monumental task: convince the Germans that the crossing was happening there instead. Just 1,100 men had to pretend to be 30,000. For 2 days, they put on the show of their lives. They inflated over 600 tanks and vehicles. They played their sonic recordings day and night. Their radio operators sent a storm of fake messages. They even sewed fake divisional patches onto their uniforms and drove trucks back and forth to towns where they knew German spies were watching, just to spread rumors. And it worked. The German high command fell for it completely. They repositioned their forces, aiming their heavy artillery and divisions at the Phantom Army. While the Germans were staring at rubber tanks, the real 9th Army crossed the Rhine further north with minimal resistance. It's estimated that the Ghost Army's deception saved thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of American lives in that one operation alone. But when the war ended, their story didn't come out. The men were sworn to secrecy. The army classified all records of their existence. But because the tactic was considered so effective, they wanted to be able to use it again in future conflicts. So these heroes came home, and they kept their promise. They couldn't tell their wives, their children, or their friends about what they really did in the war. They went back to their lives, designing buildings, painting pictures, creating advertisements. Their incredible story was locked away. The story was finally declassified in 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. Only then did the world learn about the army of artists who fought with illusion. In 2022, they were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest honor. A long overdue recognition for their bravery, their ingenuity, and the lives they saved. The story of the Ghost Army reminds us that warfare isn't just about strength, but about cleverness, and that heroism comes in many forms. It's not always the person with the gun. Sometimes, it's the person with the paintbrush, the speaker, or the most powerful weapon of all, a brilliant idea.